And I'm going to weave together three broad strands of my own interests and inquiry. The first of those is for life drawing to maintain a kind of rigorous and critical position. The second is an ongoing inquiry which I've been undertaking for many years on what actually happens in a studio between artists and models. And this is, unfortunately, an arena that hasn't had a lot of theoretical or critical attention paid to it. And the third concerns my own practice, and I'm going to be showing you some examples from my own practice, my drawings this afternoon as well. And my own drawings deal with portraiture, life drawing, artist model transactions, and specifically menace, malfunction, and desire that are at the heart of the artist model transaction. So what I'm going to do today is pose a simple question. What takes place in the life drawing studio? More specifically, what does an artist do with a model, and what does a model do with an artist in the life drawing studio? And to get at that, I'm going to share with you a couple of the different strategies that I've used in order to try to make some sense, to find some order in those questions and some relevance in contemporary education and practice. All right, now, in order to clarify the problems embedded in the questions of life drawing, I'm going to take an approach to life drawing which is somewhat unusual in that I'm going to invoke the cultural rhetoric of zombies. And as I will show, the zombie is an ideal vehicle by which to illuminate the structures, theatrics, and the technologies of life drawing. Inviting the zombie into the life drawing practice, or revealing its presence there, can provide the educator, the student, the model, the artist, and the spectator with reformed strategies for understanding what takes place in the life drawing exchange. What I find so interesting about zombies is the way that the zombie becomes such a it's an analog for the life model in that the zombie is the pure body, right? The pure body, the pure other that can be transacted in all sorts of different ways. It's animate and inanimate at exactly the same time. And it's neither completely inanimate nor completely animate. It also is interesting, the zombie, because the zombie is a victim in many ways. The zombie is vulnerable, and the zombie is that which must be othered in order to be understood. And in contemporary zombie research, what we see is that the life-death binarism that typically circulates in life drawing is completely challenged by this thing which is neither living or dead. When we see the model posing on the dais, we see the body that is both purely static, but also that which is alive and animated at the same time. So what we see in essence is a model, a zombie that inhabits liminal spaces where the boundaries between art and sex, education and recreation, cultural milieus claiming an affiliation with high art, these things are actively produced and contested. That's in the words of Margaret Mayhew. I would extend this to say that this also asserts a liminal space, the zombie as the model, between professional art and amateurism, between subject and object, between voyeurism and exhibitionism, and between master and slave. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into the history of zombies and zombie culture. You can read my other writing about that in other places. But I do instead want to talk about the way that I can bridge over from zombies to horror as a way of looking at life drawing in a way of hopefully sort of energizing life drawing in contemporary practice. In her work on horror films, the philosopher Patricia McCormick describes zombies as having no race, no gender, no sexuality, just baroque, fleshy, unique viscera configurations. And that's the fundamental problem with life drawing, is we draw bodies, but we don't draw human beings. The human referent dies off, but the body remains on the dais. So the pose of the model both destroys and also reanimates the model. So how do we as artists approach this? It's threatening, it's disarming, how do we come at it? And what I'm going to argue is the environment of life drawing at university and in studio practice should be one in which infection, death, appetite, proximity, transmission, and action become dominant considerations. Furthermore, I'm going to argue that conventional considerations such as decorum, distance, silence, stasis, antisepsis, and passivity should be completely discarded. I'm going to move forward now and talk a little bit about this drawing by Edgar Degas. And I first came to zombies because I was looking at a method for interrogating life drawing the position of the model. And as I was looking at zombies and investigating and reading and watching zombie narratives, I was looking at an art history book. I collect a lot of old drawing books, and I came across this particular drawing. And it's called Young Woman Yawning. It's one of Degas' late drawings. It's undated, but assumed to be one of his late drawings. And it's I find it quite sinister, in fact, because of the way she seems not to have any stress or yawning, but she seems to be inserting her hand into her mouth, a kind of calm consumption of her hand. But Degas was an academic life drawer. That was his training. He was perhaps the most accomplished draftsman of all of the French Impressionists. And this drawing is something that you will see me refer to again and again and again in my own work as the yawning becomes a symbol of infection and the involuntary response. I began to think of yawning as a really interesting event that happens on the life drawing dais. Models yawn all the time, students yawn all the time, and yet yawning is almost never depicted in drawings. I began then to look into yawning very, very specifically in terms of the physiology and neurology of yawning. Yawning is something which is not understood very clearly at all. There's been a little bit of work done on it. We yawn, animals yawn, lots of people yawn, but we're not exactly sure why we yawn. There are several theories about it. A lot of contemporary neurologists actually attach the idea of yawning to arousal and sexual desire, which is not the way we usually think about yawning. Yawning is also something which is contagious. It's infectious. And nobody really understands why yawning is infectious. But of course, yawning is infectious, it's contagious, and the vector of infection is the mouth. And so it becomes a really interesting analogy again to zombieism. And the way that yawning also deals with the involuntary and the spasmodic. So I began to look at this idea of yawning as a type of involuntary behavior, as a type of manifestation of zombieism, and that which is pure body, pure physicality, but something that cannot be controlled by the conscious mind. And to that, then, I will show you one of my own drawings. This is a drawing in which I appropriate, as you can see at the top, the Degas drawing of the young woman yawning, which is incorporated with a lot of self-portraits of yawning as well. This is a 2-meter long trace monotype on linen. And these are large trace monotype drawings that I do because the trace monotype, the inked plate, becomes that vector of transmission again and enables me to bring in all of these qualities of touching, of proximity, of looking, and oftentimes I create these monotypes in live drawing performances with other models where there is direct transmission and infection that happens as well. All right. Now, from, again, these different modes of thinking about yawning, thinking about infection, thinking about artist-model relationships, from there I began to transition out into another investigation, trying to bring performative methods into the life drawing exchange. And I had seen this artist work before in some of his performance drawings, especially from the 1980s, but was unaware of his connection to Brisbane and his connection to Australia even. And in an investigation of Dragan Ilic, I started to uncover this really, really fascinating event that happened here in Brisbane in 1979 and happened at the Queensland College of Art. It was actually before it was called QCA. It was back when it was called the Brisbane College of Art, and it was at the Seven Hills campus. And this is actually a photograph of the room where this performance took place in 1979. Now, what's interesting about this 1979 performance is, like my investigation into zombies, nudity, proximity, regulation, body marking, they all coalesced in this one event. So in 1979, the artist Dragan Ilic was invited by the Institute of Modern Art to stage one of his performances, Electronic Pencils, and it was in a show with Jill Orr. So Ilic does this performance at the Institute of Modern Art, and several of the instructors at the Brisbane College of Art see the performance, meet Dragan Ilic, and they invite him to come to the College of Art and give a presentation. And he goes and he does Human Canvas. Human Canvas ultimately resulted in complaints, criminal investigations, resignations, and profoundly affected a number of Brisbane artists and scholars. It's a very important point in QCA history. The videotape and all of the photographs of this particular event were confiscated by the criminal investigation branch of the federal police. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. well-known Australian artist Barbara Campbell, was actually present as a student at this particular event. And this is how she describes it. Ilic had been invited onto campus by some of the painting staff who were themselves artists. It seemed just an amusing distraction during our lunchtime. Ilic and later a couple of students stripped off and became canvases for audience members to draw on their bodies using colored pens fitted into electric drills. The event had been videoed. Overnight, Yelke Peterson's Vice Squad raided the homes of some of the lecturers who'd been present, looking for the video recordings of the nude performance. Now, the Barbara Campbell's account squares with the other accounts of the performance that I've gathered in broad strokes. Ilic set up paper in this large studio space at the Seven Hills campus, contained approximately 200 staff and students. He rigged 5 electric drills in which he inserted charcoal, chalk, and fiber-tipped pens. After demonstrating methods of drawing with the electric drills, he declared that he would strip off his clothes and invite the audience to draw on his body. After several minutes, he invited the spectators to strip down and join him in the performance, and 2 students disrobed, and the 3 of them drew on each other's body. Within a week, news of this began to circulate, news of real trouble began to circulate around campus. This was the first article to be published in the Sunday Sun. Less than a week after the performance, Naked Teacher told pupils to bear it all. It was largely erroneous in that it makes the claim in this article that many of the students, that all of the students there, in fact, were underage. They were 15-year-olds, which of course they weren't. There were some certificate students there at the time. It also reports that Joe Yelke Peterson was being briefed on the investigation and that the Federal Criminal Investigation Branch was involved. This is the second article to come out about a week later, which you can see juxtaposes filmed and depravity in close proximity, and quotes a parent's description of the event as live classroom pornography. Again, heavily implies that most of the students there were 15 to 17-year-old pupils. Now, it seems that the initial complaint did stem from the parent of an underage student whose teacher had brought her into the classroom. The final story, published about a month later, had this headline: "Students Got Sex Lecture," which not only really twists the intent and content of that particular performance, but also shows how politically problematic the ideas of sex education were at the time. And of course, Joe Yelke Peterson was trying to have all sex education eliminated in all Queensland schools at the time. But what I find really interesting about this is the way, again, nudity and live performance and performance drawing that involves nudity and in a classroom environment with students so quickly gets ported over into the pornographic and the sexual, which is not something actually that we should shy away from. The police ultimately failed to, quote, extract admissions of lewdness, and everyone was exonerated, but they did succeed in creating this atmosphere of reactionary politics and fear. Now, what's interesting about this is, again, the way that when we talk about this kind of performance, live performance, when we talk about life drawing, we come up immediately against all of these issues of nudity, of sexuality, of eroticism, of voyeurism, and of the vulnerability of those involved in this transaction as well. Because it's tempting to draw an easy comparison between the Dragan Ilic affair and the ouster of Thomas Akins. And this is Akins in one of the studios at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, PAFA, which is kind of a strange old bird in terms of art schools in the US. And I guess probably its closest analog here in Australia would be National Art School down in Sydney. PAFA is a place that you go in the US. It's based on the oldest art school in the US, the Columbianum, started by Charles Wilson Peale in Philadelphia. But it's a place you can go to study academic drawing, 19th century traditions, drawing from casts, et cetera, anatomy. And this is Akins in the studio with what is thought to be one of his students posing with him. And of course, it's not just Akins and one of his students, but there's a third person in this situation as well, the person who's taking the photograph. And what's so interesting about Akins is he was constantly fighting the powers at the Pennsylvania Academy for allowing people to draw from the nude in class, allowing mixed classes of men and women, allowing drawing the nude man without being covered by a drapery, and the nude female as well. And while he was censored over and over and over again by the board, until he eventually took to just posing with his models and disrobing himself in class and having his students disrobe, and oftentimes transgressing all sorts of boundaries in life drawing. One of the great taboos of life drawing, of course, is any sort of touching or physical contact. So the thought of an instructor disrobing, having students disrobe, and then carrying students naked around the classroom is not something that I recommend. But Akins and the way that he transgressed these boundaries is very interesting. And again, this is in the 1870s and 1880s. What's at the heart of my investigations of life drawing is menace. This quality of menace, malfunction, and desire that infuses everything. Menace, which implies something which is immoral or unethical, which is going on in the studio. And of course, menace infuses every aspect of Akins' practice, and ultimately is the thing which infused Dragan Ilic's practice and prosecution as well. There's many reasons why Akins was actually dismissed from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but amongst them were his methods of including his students in nude modeling, mixing clothed and nude men and women together in class and on the dais, modeling nude himself with students and other models, touching models, and in the words of Elizabeth Johns, who's an Akins scholar, participating in an atmosphere of subtle coercion. Notable in all of Akins' work, and again, this is now 140 years old, is the way that these boundaries that he was transgressing and challenging have not only snapped back into a very, very rigorous kind of regime of control, even now in the 21st century, but the way they go unquestioned and unchallenged, both in recreational life drawing and in university life drawing. Akins, of course, vehemently defended his processes and was even quoted once as saying that his conduct was befitting of all the dignity which comes from serious thoughts. I'm invoking Akins only to contextualize the conservative tradition of enacting prohibitions as a panacea for the menace and malfunction of naked performance, the transgression of professional student boundaries, artist model proximity, and photography in the studio as well. I think where I'd like to conclude here is to talk about all of these different research interests of mine, the way that they intersect, the way that they evolve, and the way that they hopefully point to potentials for implementing undergraduate drawing curriculum, reforming life drawing and learning matrices, and recognizing the strange anachronisms that plague life drawing, but the way that we can utilize that strangeness in a progressive manner, the way that we can build time-based methods, lens-based methods, performative methods into contemporary life drawing, which can bring it into alignment with 21st century concerns and ideas. So in my work, I continue to look at these different types of subtle subversions of the life drawing process, while continuing also to invoke these strategies of zombieism, gore, and yawning as very, very specific methodologies in order to highlight and hopefully progress the ways, again, in which menace and malfunction can inform contemporary drawing. All right, thank you very much.